time to fiberglass the model. After cutting out a 3/4 ounce piece of fiberglass, I lay it on the model. Then I go over it with a horsehair brush. This helps to smooth out the fiberglass and create a little bit of static cling, which helps to keep the fiberglass in place. Then I pour on the epoxy. I'm using a 2-hour pot life epoxy that I get in Taiwan. There's no English name, so I don't know what to tell you what it's called, but it gives me a lot of working time, which I like. After pouring on the epoxy, I go over it with a playing card to smooth it out. After that, I go over it with a stiffer piece of plastic card, which helps to remove any excess epoxy. I do not thin my epoxy with alcohol as some do. A finishing resin should be thin enough as it is without needing further reducing with alcohol. I think that just damages the adhesion properties of the epoxy and can make it a little bit rubbery so that it's difficult to sand. After putting down the fiberglass and the initial coat of epoxy, it's time to remove the excess epoxy. I'm using the old school method on this model, and that is using paper, towel, or toilet paper to remove the excess epoxy. I like using cheap toilet paper for this. The cheaper and coarser, the better it works. It's really not quite as messy as it may seem, as there's not a whole lot of epoxy to remove. I have included a short presentation at the end of this video which shows how the peel ply method of fiberglassing differs from what I call the old school method of fiberglassing. The epoxy has been applied with the playing card. Now I'm going back over with a piece of stiffer styrene plastic to remove any excess. The excess removed is then transferred to areas of the fiberglass where it's a little bit dry. The second part of the old school method of fiberglassing is the flow coat. The flow coat is merely a second thin layer of epoxy that is spread over the initial coat of epoxy after that coat has thoroughly cured after about 24 hours. I spread it with a playing card, and it's just a very thin coat designed to fill the weave of the fiberglass. The newer technique of using peel ply omits the flow coat step, thereby making the fiberglassing operation a little bit faster. At this point, all of the fiberglass pieces have been lightly sanded with 150 grit paper, and now a high build primer is being rolled on. You could either roll on the primer, brush it on, or spray it on. I just think rolling on is a little bit easier with the cleanup. I like to put my black guide coat on a little bit heavy. It seems to give me better demarcation lines in areas that have low depressions and need filling with auto body putty. I'm going to start wet sanding the wing. I've already done a little bit on the bottom. Work on the top now. I've got some 320 grit wet dry paper glued to a piece of hardwood. I think this is like Malaysian teak or something. Water doesn't really seem to affect it. I've already sealed it a couple of coats of sanding sealer. Okay, I think I've gone about as far as I can with the block. So I'll stop with the block, start using just a sheet of paper. Okay, the wet sanding is pretty much done for this half. The areas you see where there's a lot of black, these areas here, right here, all this stuff is going to get automotive spot putty. This, I'm not going to sand down those, they need to be filled in anyway. There's quite a few of them, as you can see. But all these things, they get spot putty, Bondo, or whatever you use. And then sand it in, probably primed again, I think. Fiberglassing a model using the peel ply method starts the same as the old school method. You lay down your fiberglass, go over it with a brush to smooth it out, apply your epoxy resin, and then I use a playing card to smooth it out. I'm really not trying to squeeze out any excess epoxy, but rather I apply just enough pressure with the card to get the epoxy to go through the fiberglass onto the balsa underneath. You don't want large pools of epoxy on top of the fiberglass, but you want to make sure that the fiberglass is thoroughly wetted out. You can see dry spots that show up as white spots through the fiberglass, and you want to spread out the epoxy just enough so that everything is thoroughly wetted out. So the epoxy has been applied, and now you put on your peel ply. Now peel ply is 100% polyester, and the dedicated name peel ply material has a coating added to it, which I believe is there to make it easier to pull off, because you will be removing the peel ply after the epoxy is cured. I use 100% polyester dress lining material, and note, let me emphasize the 100% part of that. That's just, I think it's just a little bit cheaper than your dedicated peel ply, and it's easier for me to get where I am. So I cut the peel ply a little bit larger than the area that I'm working, lay it down, and then start smoothing it out with a plastic card. I use a rather stiff plastic card, and you start from the middle of the area you want to work and work outwards. Now, the idea here is to soak up excess resin. So you want to press the card or press the peel ply down into the fiberglass and the resin, allowing the peel ply to soak up the excess epoxy. You know you're doing a good job picking up the excess resin when the peel ply starts to take on a little bit different color. As you can see on my hand, the peel ply is a little bit darker and is soaking up epoxy. Areas of the peel ply that remain white, or the whitish color, are not really picking up epoxy, and ideally you would want to add a little more epoxy to make sure that the peel ply is covered. After the epoxy has fully cured, and I usually wait 24 hours minimum, it's time to pull off the peel ply. This gives a fairly nice, smooth finish. With peel ply, now at this point, supposed to be able to go straight to a high build primer, and there really shouldn't be any pinholes. The point being is you don't really need to put on a second flow coat with this. So I'll take this, after I still have to do the other side, then I'll take them straight to primer.